So good afternoon, everyone. This is Diana Arias with the Community Technical Assistance Center of New York. I would like to welcome you to today's Mental Health Moment, a conversation about the impact of climate concerns on youth mental health. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to orient everyone so you know how to participate in today's event. If you come across any technical issues, please chat to the CTech host who will be able to assist you. We will have a Q&A portion toward the end, but we invite you to chat in your questions or comments at any point during today's presentation. We would also appreciate it if you could take a moment to fill out the brief feedback survey that will appear on your screen after you close out of the webinar. And let us know if you have any suggested topics you'd like us to cover in future offerings that would support your work. And lastly, the recording and slides for this presentation will be posted on our website, ctacny.org, within the next 3 business days. So on behalf of CTAG, it is my pleasure to welcome you to a mental health moment, an opportunity for us to discuss some of the more salient and timely issues in children and adolescent mental health. And in today's mental health moment, we're going to be talking about the psychological impact of environmental concerns for young people. Today, we have Drs. Hudson and Pinsky. Dr. Kelsey Hudson is a child and adolescent clinical psychologist based in Massachusetts. Dr. Hudson is chair of the Youth Subcommittee of the Climate Psychology Alliance of North America. Her research focuses on the mental health impacts of climate change on youth, and her clinical practice includes youth who are active in the climate movement. Dr. Elizabeth Pinsky is a child and adolescent psychiatrist and pediatrician at Massachusetts General Hospital, where she is the associate director of the Pediatric Psychiatry Consultation Service and at Shriners Hospital for Children in Boston. Her clinical interests focus on the intersection of pediatric, mental, and physical health, including trauma associated with medical care and fostering resilience in medically ill young people. So I'm going to present a very brief overview of the concern and where we stand right now in regards to climate change and youth mental health, and then I'm going to bring in our speakers. So we know that our climate is changing at an alarming rate. Climate change has important implications for us all, but especially the well-being and future of children and adolescents. And because climate change has the potential to affect their environments in which children are born in, play, learn, and so forth, climate change can be considered a social determinant of health, and more precisely, as others have argued, a social and ecological determinant of mental health. We are also in the middle of a youth mental health crisis. So the U.S. Surgeon General's advisory report, Protecting Youth Mental Health, released in late 2021, specifically lists climate change concerns as a factor that affects the mental health of young people. So climate incidences can impact mental health in several ways. One is directly, so resulting from trauma or PTSD from experiencing natural disasters. Another way is indirectly, for example, distress from hunger, as changes in the frequency and severity of, say, droughts and floods threatened food security, food safety, food production, food distribution, and also through psychological distress, so a result of the awareness of climate change. And we also know that climate distress is prevalent in young people, both nationally and globally. So findings indicate that children and youth are reporting feelings of sadness, guilt, and powerlessness, among others. And young people are also concerned, are also more concerned than older adults about the climate change. I do want to point out that terms such as eco-anxiety, climate grief are used to describe the impact of climate change and mental health. However, it's really important to note that climate distress is not pathological. And we'll get a little bit more into that with our conversation today. So with this information as a backdrop, I would like to start our conversation about the impact of climate change concerns on youth mental health with Drs. Hudson and Pinsky. As a reminder, please chat in your questions or comments as we go along for the Q&A portion. Again, Drs. Hudson and Dr. Pinsky, thank you for taking the time to be here. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Great, thank you. So I guess we can just go ahead and jump in, right? So how does climate change impact young people's mental health?
I'm happy to take the first question, but please jump in, Elizabeth. You outlined it so beautifully, Diana. There's many different ways that we can think about climate change impacting kids and young people's mental health. There's a lot of different ways to think about it. I really love the kind of domains that you laid out in terms of the direct impacts, which we usually think about in terms of extreme weather events or the aftermath of natural disasters, largely including trauma, but all of the things that can happen for kids and young people, including disruptions in their family and community and educational lives. But then there's also so many indirect effects, like the effects from heat and drought, the impacts on our physical health and how that impacts our mental health. And then what we're seeing more and more of is this kind of growing distress around having awareness of climate change and all of the thoughts and feelings that that can bring up and all of the ways that that can impact kids' behavior.
I would agree that, there's a few different ways that we can think about chunking together the mental health impacts of climate change on young people, and the domains you came up with are great ones. There are really clear data linking severe weather events in particular with a whole range of depression, anxiety, certainly post-traumatic stress disorder, as both of you mentioned, increased rates of suicide. Extreme heat has been linked to increased presentations for mental health crises, like emergency department visits for folks who are really in crisis, as well as interpersonal violence. So both child abuse and domestic violence have been linked to extreme heat and to severe weather events. There also are just some really direct medical issues that can arise in the setting of climate change and specifically mental illness. So a lot of the medications that we use, that we might prescribe for folks who have a variety of different psychiatric issues, actually can make people more susceptible to extreme heat and less able to regulate their temperature. So they're really, that's an enormous question, and one that I know we'll get into more over the course of the hour, but climate change impacts, in my mind, sort of every aspect of both mental health and also just sort of well-being.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and I really appreciate both of your answers because it really sort of lays out the connection between climate change and just so many different components and aspects of our lives, right? Not just the mental health, but the physical health, and almost like talking about in sort of nested ecological sort of model, right? It's not just the individual, but the individual within their community, within society at large. And also, really thinking about all these other issues, right? As you were mentioning, the medical ones, which we might not really think about, right? What are the impacts of some of the climate change, rising temperatures? How does that interact with medication and how people present themselves? And clearly in a time where, as was mentioned earlier, we really are seeing an increase in visits to the emergency department for so many reasons, but I think climate change may not be at the forefront for a lot of folks. So again, thank you for being here. So, obviously the focus here is on youth mental health, and I guess I wanted to take it a little bit further and ask, is climate distress a mental health disorder or considered a psychopathology? And I asked this more so, because I mentioned a couple of these other terms that we have heard before or are currently hearing a little bit more often now: climate anxiety, climate grief, which are being used within the mental field to maybe identify and describe what's happening. But I also wanted to get your thoughts around the use of this terminology.
We should probably tag
Let's
team
start with this one,
but do you want to start off, Elizabeth?
Sure thing. So what I would say is that for sure, all of these different terms have come to the fore over the last really couple decades: climate anxiety, climate grief, solastalgia, which is a term people might have heard that refers to a sense of homesickness when you are already at home. Ecological grief. We've come up with all of these different ways to try to capture what's really arguably a new human experience, something we've never experienced before. I say arguably because there are certainly communities and groups of people who've faced incredible existential threat in the past, but collectively as humans, we haven't really faced a threat like this before. So we're of course looking for ways to capture the gravity of the situation while also not wanting, in my mind, to pathologize strong feelings associated with that, right? Even anxiety is adaptive. Anxiety is what we experience to alert us to an oncoming threat and to allow us to prepare for it. If we weren't anxious, we wouldn't run away from bears or study for our algebra tests, right? So we're trying to come up with all of these terms to describe it. And I think that's why the language and the vocabulary has gotten a little bit complicated. But at its core, no, anxiety and distress about climate change and ecological breakdown in general are not pathologic at all. I would argue that actually not feeling somewhat anxious and distressed about what's happened to the environment is pathological at this point. Certainly, as with any normal human response to distressing events, whether it's grief or living with life-threatening illness or anything, certainly sometimes people can also have pathology associated with those really difficult experiences, but climate anxiety, climate distress, eco-anxiety, whatever we want to call it, in and of itself is not pathology. I don't know if you want to add anything, Kelsey.
I think this is a really important question because of how our healthcare system is set up. At the same time, we're saying, yes, this is a really natural and empathic and understandable, reasonable response to an actual crisis, while we also have a system that requires us to slap on a lot of diagnoses and labels to get people into healthcare systems and settings. So I think it's an important question, and also one that leads the psychological and public health community and the healing community to think about the ways that we want to kind of address climate distress in large scale settings, for example, schools, community settings like libraries, in a way that we can really embrace how this is a natural caring response, and also provide supports to kids. On the topic also of all the terms that have come out, I think that's also a way to try to be sensitive of the complex and varied psychological responses that people can have, and to try to be more inclusive. For example, some communities might understandably chafe at the term eco-anxiety, and that doesn't feel right for them because it's not the first time they've had to grapple with an existential threat. So that doesn't resonate with their lived experiences. So I see the terms coming up as a way to try to be more inclusive of the complicated psychological reactions that we're seeing.
Great, thank you. And I really appreciate sort of the emphasis on, the fact that the distress around this topic is common and sort of expected for folks, right? It's not this pathological, because I think, yeah, some of those terms can sort of sound scary, right? Like, oh, eco-anxiety. So there is a diagnosis for anxiety, and that's what we need to do with this. So I agree with, you all saying it's a way of maybe trying to identify or call more attention to it, but let's be careful not to really pathologize a common reaction, right? Similar to what's done in trauma-informed care, right? Like, a lot of reactions are common, are expected, and this is okay. Let's just figure this out. Let's go through these feelings and see how we can attend to them and try to alleviate, and certainly the point of behavioral health. So thank you so much for that. So I will say that climate change feels like a unique issue in the sense that, we know that it's coming. We are clearly experiencing some of those real, frequent, and severe consequences right now. And science has and continues to warn us about future consequences. And I've heard the term pre-traumatic stress. So many of us here might be familiar with post-traumatic stress. But for me personally, just when I was delving into this sort of literature around climate change and impact on mental health, I had never heard the term pre-traumatic stress. And all of a sudden it was just sort of this light bulb that went on. And I was like, oh my God, this makes so much sense. So I'm wondering if you can maybe talk a little bit about that for folks that maybe haven't heard that, just share your thoughts around that, or primarily how that's a pathway to climate related concerns for folks.
I think this term was coined by Lise Van Susteren. Is that your understanding, Elizabeth?
I actually don't know.
So this is not, just to clarify, a new diagnosis or another type of traumatic stress disorder. I think it's my understanding that it's a validating way to encompass the experience of living through a traumatic event and seeing the traumatic events unfold before us. So I think we could think about it kind of like how people living through civil war or refugees and asylum seekers, people with community violence that makes them feel unsafe around them. That's not necessarily going to be post anything in terms of PTSD. It might be chronic traumatic stress. And I think this term has come about to validate the enormity of the trauma that may come our way from the climate crisis, and to highlight that it's pretty understandable and natural for us to have some PTSD symptoms in our bodies or in our minds about climate change, even if we haven't directly experienced the impacts, or if we don't have PTSD.
I would agree with all that, and just taking it one step farther. I'm curious actually, Diana, what it was about that particular word choice that resonated with you. And again, all of these different terms, I think there's pros and cons to them and they resonate in different ways. One of the experiences with eco-anxiety or climate distress or whatever, climate feelings, whatever we're going to call it, that people often talk about, you know, when we think about the core symptom clusters of post-traumatic stress disorder, hyperarousal, and then avoidance and numbing are two of those really like core symptom clusters for people who are experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. And for folks who are really struggling with climate distress, often it's those same two poles of feeling really, really anxious and overwhelmed and paralyzed by fear and overwhelm and hyperarousal, and then sometimes needing to disengage and be numb and sort of avoid thinking about the problem as one of the other poles. And so I certainly don't need to compare necessarily the two experiences, but it's one of the ways that that way of thinking about climate distress, I think, resonates for me.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think as I was reading the literature, you know, it kind of made sense, but just sort of naming it to kind of help explain, or, you know, as was mentioned earlier, really sort of validate that, right? That this is probably the first time collectively that we're going through this sort of existential crisis, right? From hearing and watching things in the news, what's happening here within the US and across the world. It's sort of the first time, and it's the first in a short amount of time, right? From a global pandemic, you know, we've obviously, I think through technology, been exposed to so much more that's happening in terms of racial and social injustices, climate change, obviously, as what we're talking about now. So it seems that there's just been a lot in a short amount of time. So, you know, the focus here being on young people, children and adolescents. How do they really sort of process all that when developmentally, maybe they haven't really develop those coping skills yet, right? But there's a way where they're experiencing it, where the body is sort of kind of keeping the score, right? Like of what they're watching and what they're hearing. So finding out ways to just really to how to support that. But yeah, I appreciate all of your responses. Thank you.
If I can interrupt, I'm sorry, Diana, about the kind of traumatic stress presentation. I also think it's really important to think about the traumatic growth that can come in any traumatic experience. And there are some new ways of understanding and thinking about all the varied emotions that come from climate change. And some of them are neutral and even welcomed or positive emotions, like feeling empowered or hopeful or curious or kind of approaching versus avoiding. So I think that's something that isn't often talked about, as we very understandably talk about and focus on the distress. And I think that's part of the pre-traumatic stress terminology as well, as thinking about it holistically in terms of distress and growth that comes from a traumatic and overwhelming experience.
Thank you. I appreciate you sharing that, because you're right. I think this is sort of what's eye-catching for folks, right? It's like climate anxiety, climate, you know, eco-anxiety. But then I have heard, you know, obviously we know the importance of sort of looking at the other side of that, right? As you were saying, sort of that post-traumatic growth or the resilience component of things, right? So I think I've heard compassion, curiosity, or climate compassion, something along those lines of saying, hey, yes, let's normalize some of this climate distress, but it's not this sort of anxiety or grief, right? That really carries with it a particular connotation, right? Let's maybe flip the script or also be more inclusive and recognize like the resilience in that, and recognize, you know, what you can do to sort of empower yourself and contribute towards society, right? Now that we're becoming aware of, that much more aware of what the concerns are in regards to climate. So thank you.
Of course.
So, you know, keeping it within the U.S., different geographical areas of the U.S. are being impacted in unique ways. But I think this is also true for certain groups of people, and not certain, you know, not only within climate change, but obviously other larger issues as well. And here I'm thinking about historically marginalized and under-resourced communities. So I'm wondering if you can speak to the relationship between the impact of climate change and systemic inequities and health disparities, right? Mental health disparities, and also along just primary health. So wondering if we can pull in both of your expertise here and really sort of delve into that a bit more.
Sure. I'm seeing Ingrid's popping up in the chat at a really opportune point here. And I would actually say, Diana, that I'm not sure we do need to keep it in the US to sort of discuss this piece of things. We often talk about climate change as being a threat multiplier. So what do I mean by that? It takes the existing disparities and inequalities that are baked into our system, talking both about the US and globally, and it makes them worse. So structural racism, health disparities, economic inequality, inequities in terms of housing and infrastructure, educational inequity, disability and including in disability, mental illness, language barriers, sort of all of the different ways that we are living in a society that has inequity and disparities baked into it. Climate change makes that worse. And even there's a school of thought that even the fact that we in the global north and in New York, and Kelsey and I are in Boston, are having this conversation about eco-anxiety now is almost emblematic of that. Because to talk about this vicarious sort of exposure and anxiety and psychological distress associated with climate change, there are many parts of the world and absolutely parts of the United States. Much of the literature around sort of post-traumatic stress associated with severe weather came from Katrina and from Hurricane Maria. We're sort of talking about it now because it has caught up to us, but there are many communities and many places in the world that have been dealing with very, very direct mental health impacts of climate change for decades, and we're sort of catching up now. And so that's one of the reasons that hopefully as we sort of start to talk about responses to and interventions for climate distress, centering environmental justice and justice in general to those conversations is absolutely key. I don't know what you have to add, Kelsey.
That was really well said. And I think Ingrid's point is really important here, because not everybody uses language like the mental health impacts of climate change or climate anxiety or climate grief. The mental health impacts of climate change can come so clearly from distress, in this example, like about finding adequate and affordable housing after a flood. Like Elizabeth was saying, the infrastructure, the housing inequities and inequalities that we see, those are all completely exacerbated by the impacts of climate change. So as we continue to understand what the mental health impacts look like in different communities, it's also really important that we target community-based research approaches instead of top-down public health approaches. For example, like going into communities and asking what they need, asking what types of interventions or adaptation or mitigation strategies might be most effective, because there are so many gaps in things like housing, transportation, education that might be missed if we don't ask communities directly what it is that they need.
Great, thank you. And yeah, I agree. I think Ingrid's point really brings that to light, right? So in terms of working with folks that are living in poverty impacted communities, right? And her comment about, folks that are living at ground level or basement level apartments, and then they have been impacted by recent floods or, whatever climate change it might be, and repairs not being made. So I just want to share this for future recordings because we might not be able to see the chat, but I do appreciate that because there is such a connection and such an impact, both domestically and globally. Certainly agree, Dr. Pinsky. But if we're not making those connections for folks, it's a very missed opportunity to really attend to the mental health and just overall wellness, right? The primary health and mental wellness as well. So since we're on the topic here, I did see another question come in. So maybe maybe we can tackle it now. Can you talk about how organizing for climate justice is a part of addressing the mental health impacts of climate change and the role of clinicians and youth workers in the connection between organizing and healing?
Love this question.
That one's for you, Kelsey.
All right.
Love this question. That one's for you.
I'm going to take this not because I'm any sort of expert, but many of my clients are youth activists or have experience with organizing. So maybe this is a good time to share that graphic. What do you think, Diana?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I can grab it up if that works.
Sure, if you want to do that.
See this okay?
Perfect, yeah.
Okay, so this, I'll just share what this is and then get to the question. This is a bunch of blobs that share different core components of promising interventions for climate distress with a focus on validating and normalizing the experiences of BIPOC young people. And as you can see here, there's all these pretty understandable things like acknowledging and validating feelings, helping people connect socially. But the last square is climate justice awareness, and there's also climate action in here. And so what we're starting to see is the importance of, and also we've known this for a really long time, importance of climate action to help people feel more empowered and build more agency, but also keeping a focus on the environmental justice aspect to make sure that our actions and our engagement have an eye on existing inequalities and making sure our valued actions are in line with that. So one of the most important considerations is what we want to do to help people build agency and find a community of either activists or find organizations that they feel will be valuable for them. That is a really key component of climate aware therapy. But even before people get to that point, we really have to support the self-care, the burnout prevention, and the ability to kind of observe our thoughts and feelings so that we can build foundations in order to really help our clients do the work that they want to do. I think it's also really helpful to be creative in our definitions of organizing and activism. For some people, it's neither safe nor feasible to go do things like protests or strikes. So actions can be individual, they can be at the family level, they can be at the school level, or they can be on a broad organizing level with things like the Power Shift Network, Climate Justice Alliance. Those are some really excellent youth-focused environmental justice organizations. Obviously things like the Sunrise Movement and Fridays for Future. There are a lot of really awesome organizations that people might feel empowered by joining. But if we help people to get there too quickly, we will be missing all of the foundational coping tools that they will need to use for years ahead in their journey towards engagement in the climate crisis.
And I would just add to Kelsey's, I think, really like foundational point about helping people move towards action, but making sure that they're doing so with support and bolstered and all of the self-care stuff as well. That applies to us too. And one of the things that I think makes, as a clinician working on this so interesting is that, certainly when we're working with someone who's experiencing whatever it is, a specific type of trauma or depression or anxiety or adjustment to parenthood or like whatever it is, we oftentimes share something with the person we're working with. And this is an area where we are all experiencing actually exactly the same thing. We're all in the same boat in terms of what we're facing, not necessarily responses to it, but what we're facing. And I find that more than any other area where I work, when people attend a webinar like this or come to hear a talk, they're there as a clinician, but they're also often there as a parent or as an individual who's struggling with these feelings. And I certainly struggle with climate distress myself. And I would just say that like young people we work with, finding a community of fellow activists can be so helpful as an adult. I have my own. To help cope with feelings of climate distress, finding a community of like-minded folks to be taking action with locally is really important, with all of the caveats around self-care and making sure that you're sort of in a good place psychologically that Kelsey mentioned.
Great, thank you so much. Really helpful and insightful. So I guess maybe sort of piggybacking on what was just said, obviously folks that are joining us, we saw a couple of people describing their roles and titles, right? So we have therapists, social workers, family peer advocates, but it's certainly within that capacity to support children, adolescents, transition age youth, families. But because, climate concerns or climate related concerns might not have been the primary reason for someone to seek support, I'm wondering if there's sort of practical tips or even sort of language around how we can maybe even introduce that as someone who's there to support a child, a family, a caregiver, to maybe sort of almost figure out, are there concerns, right? It might be sort of this underlying concern that folks might have, but it's not at the forefront because they are coming in for, like you just said, Dr. Pinksley, right? The depression or the anxiety, but how do we maybe even try to assess for some of these concerns along the lines of climate change?
That's a beautiful question. There's a lot of different things that we can do. I think we can add climate aware questions and weather aware questions into our assessments. For example, with young people, the majority of young people are going to have awareness of climate change, whether that means the weather around them or the kind of existential elements. You can pretty much guarantee that they know something about it. So just by asking kids one question about climate change, that can serve as an acknowledgement and a validation that this is an important thing that their providers are thinking about and asking about. So it could be something, after an extreme weather event, like, have you been feeling worried about more happening? Or how is the heat impacting you and your family? Or it could be something like, lots of kids and adolescents are feeling concerned about climate change. How has it been making you feel? Is that something you think about? And it can just kind of open the door, even in a few minutes. I think another important point is that maybe less so in our region, but as we think about different geopolitical sections of the country, some people chafe at the term climate change or may not feel comfortable talking about something like global warming or climate change. That often is the case for generational gaps as well. So asking a young person what they feel, you might get a really different answer than when the whole family's together or when their parents are in the room. So using different language based on kind of what's happening around us, like the weather, or something like the housing example that has been brought up, is a great way to talk about all the health and mental health impacts of climate change without necessarily needing to say the words climate change or global warming or whatever is coming to your mind. I feel like I rambled a bit there. I'm not sure if that makes sense.
No, I think it absolutely does. Sorry, did you want to jump in, Dr. Pinksley?
No, I was just going to say that I agree with all that. I also think that, especially depending on whether you're back in your office or not at this point, having visual cues for things, especially for kids, I think can be really helpful. New Hampshire Healthcare Workers for Climate Action has awesome child-appropriate posters just to have up in your waiting room or in your interview room that are really fun and colorful that talk about sort of climate. They're free too. I can pop a link in the chat. Or, you know, the same way that we want to be sending cues to kids that we are safe people. You know, when we ask about pronouns, we're making sure that, you know, sort of gender expansive kids know that we're safe people. When we, you know, make sure that our literature is in multiple languages, or, you know, so finding ways in the interview, as Kelsey talks about, or even just in your physical space or your background, to let kids know that you are open to hearing about that worry, I think can be important, because even if it's not on the forefront that day, it is the kind of thing that might sometimes come up for kids or for young people, for youth down the road.
Great, thank you. And I appreciate both of your responses, because I think it really calls to the need to assess for, or on a holistic level, right? Whether it is some of these sort of what we call social determinants of health, right? How is your environment? How's your home? You know, do you feel safe there? Do you have enough food to eat, right? Things that we can really, that impact mental health, even if it's not the reason that they're solely there. And it just seems like a missed opportunity if we're not asking for some of these other things, because we can address one thing, but if they're still returning to those conditions that are not safe, or, you know, are causing distress, then we kind of have this revolving door around folks. So I really appreciate, you know, really this notion of having the opportunity to ask, and ask in a way that's respectful of whether it's culture or age appropriate, you know, that really sort of just kind of very friendly, kind of just nonchalantly kind of opens up the door, right? Have you been thinking about this? How do you feel about it? And at least certainly here in downstate, you know, we've had a long heat wave of about a week or so. So how does that make you feel? How are you feeling about that? And I'm sure a lot of folks probably have responses to that. So thank you so much for that. So we might have actually answered this other question that I had, right? But how can providers talk to young people about climate change? But maybe more specifically, is there something that they should not be doing, right? We've talked about ways of maybe making the office sort of friendly, kind of bringing it up at least visually, being more exclusive in terms of posters or signage, things along those lines. But how can they talk to children, to adolescents per se, or is there anything specific that they should not be doing within that age group?
One thing that we see on a really broad scale is the sense of isolation that young people feel, and betrayal by governments and older generations who they perceive have very understandably not acted in time, or have not taken urgent action on the safety of their future. So one thing that is definitely not recommended is something like trying to reframe an anxiety about climate change, or change the person's worries. A lot of kids will come in and say, this is the first time that someone has taken me seriously about my anxiety or grief. So the power of just acknowledging that that's a really real thought and feeling, and not trying to shift it, not trying to change it right away, can be very impactful. And then depending on your framework that you work from, I was trained in CBT. A big part of that is cognitive restructuring, or helping someone kind of change their thought based on evidence, which is, you know, in this case, the evidence is really hard to argue into a calm thought. So there are different things like trying to find meaning and purpose in trying to help kids find meaning and purpose throughout this crisis, trying to build agency and join with others who can be socially connected. But yeah, I think the isolation piece and feeling alone or misunderstood by parents, siblings, peers even, that's a really real part of the experience of climate distress for a lot of young people.
Great. So, I guess as a follow up, and it seems like it might be the same or similar response for caregivers, right? How can caregivers talk to children, and what are some things that they should not do? So, at least what I heard from what you were saying, Dr. Hudson, is certainly the validation piece is huge. Creating that space for them, for children, for adolescents to really share how they're feeling, validating those experiences. But it also just seems creating that safe space, right? So that a child and adolescent feels comfortable enough to share that. And I don't know, I mean, obviously that's what you just mentioned. I would assume that that would be translatable or transfer also to caregivers, but is there something else that maybe might be unique to caregivers of children or caregivers of adolescents? Again, things that they should do or shouldn't do that might be different.
I would add that I think one is that for caregivers or parents, managing one's own anxiety and managing one's own distress is perhaps the most fundamental piece of helping your kids with theirs. And that certainly doesn't mean denying strong feelings or denying distress about this stuff, but making sure that you are doing what you need to do to be present for your own kid and to be able to have these conversations and support them in their own experience. And we, as someone who works with medically ill kids, put on your own oxygen mask first is what we always tell parents who are dealing with something really difficult. And that is perhaps one difference between clinicians and parents. I think much of what Kelsey just said absolutely applies to parents too, in terms of not minimizing, but making sure that you're doing your own self-care and managing your own feelings around this, I think is really important for parents.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and I think sometimes caregivers sort of forget that sometimes, right? Because it's always a priority as the child and making sure that they're okay and that they're safe. But yeah, as you were speaking, actually, that's kind of the image that I had, right? Like put on your air mask first, your oxygen mask first, and then you can support those around you. So I really appreciate you sort of highlighting the importance of self-care. And since we're sort of on this topic, of interventions and those being that appropriate, we did have a question come in from Christine. I'm wondering about how some of these interventions can be applied to early childhood mental health. Young children are often so aware of changes and disruption in their environment, but may not be able to fully understand climate change as we would explain to older children and adults.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful question. And it makes me think of the idea of co-benefits or things that also help with health, helping with the mental health impacts of climate change and vice versa. So for example, things like helping young kids get into nature. There's a spectrum of nature, right? That could be a plant in a store or in your house. That could be some dirt on a sidewalk or a bug. That could be a yard. It could be the wilderness. There's all sorts of ways to access nature with the understanding that for some people that may not feel safe. So helping young people build respect for living things like plants and animals, which they naturally already demonstrate already, helping them cultivate a sense of collective action, like saying we instead of you. We need to help take care of this animal, or we need to take care of this plant because it's important for our planet, things like that. And then there's all sorts of co-benefits that come from that. Being outside, spending positive time with a caregiver mental health. There's all sorts of beautiful kind of runoff effects from cultivating positivity around caring for our planet and other species.
I would agree with that. And certainly, I'm not sure I even understand climate change, in terms of like how can any of us understand climate change? Even little kids can certainly understand pollution. I have a kindergartner and a third grader, and they absolutely understand the basics of sort of greenhouse gases and, it's a blanket around the earth, it's making things hotter and wetter. Even little kids can understand the basics. But little kids also really like to be helpers, and identifying as a helper in whatever way that means, whether that means, our family's going to do a good job turning off the lights, our family's going to make sure we don't litter, if our family's going to the park, we're going to bring a bag with us and we're going to pick up stuff as we go, whatever it is. Little kids love to feel competent and love to be helpers. And that can be a way to start that conversation around climate and the environment really young. I think of it sometimes as analogous to not wanting to have like the sex talk with your kids when they're too old, starting that conversation in an age-appropriate way before they can ever remember that it was awkward. You're in much better shape. So starting to have those conversations in an age-appropriate way, definitely even with preschoolers, I think is possible.
Yeah,
So
thank you.
True. I think we can also capitalize on the early development of kids understanding that something is fair or unfair and right or wrong. And basically all of climate change is about what's not fair and what is wrong. So those are really simple terms that they already, and concepts that they already understand. And we can just use kind of little kid language to apply that to the planet and animals and plants and groups of people.
Thank you. And I appreciate all those suggestions, right? So even from just going outside and whether it's a park or if there's a lack of access to parks around you, right? Maybe just a bug on the ground, like you said, right? I'm living in sort of maybe an urban or an area where there's not that many trees, there's not a park, right? But we can sort of go out there and, oh, there's a lightning bug or there's, a caterpillar or a worm, just a way of connecting and really starting to start that respect with nature. And certainly as soon as you said that, yeah, children like to be helpers, I was like, oh yeah, right. Right. There's a sense of empowerment in that, right? Like I did that, or no, I can do it. I don't need your help, right? Because they're developing their own skills. So as you were saying, right, really carving a space out for folks in terms of really attending to climate change and just slowly but surely helping them understand what's happening in a way that's age appropriate, I think is really helpful. So I know from some of the comments that came in, that was really helpful to hear. Thank you. So I know we're doing sort of a combination of, some of the questions that we wanted to put out there, but I do see a couple of questions. So I think we're just sort of going to combine Q&A portion here and there. We saw another question come in. How do you help adolescents feel like they can make a difference when celebrities they may follow on social media are taking private jets? And you totally took that question out of my mind. That's exactly one of the things that I've been thinking about recently.
I think honestly, this gets a little bit at what we were teaching the preschoolers when we were talking to them about what's fair and what's unfair, right? Yeah. Because we can all pick up all the trash we want. We can eat as many, Impossible burgers as we want. The fact of the matter is that climate change is a problem that's perpetuated by corporations and the, richest of the rich of the 1%. And, it's the private jets. It's not any one of us who's causing the problem. And I guess I think, teenagers, there were some studies about anti-smoking campaigns for teenagers in the 90s, I think. And all of the campaigns that sort of told people like not to smoke because it was bad for you and sort of stuff like that were not nearly as effective as the campaigns where people being like, those tobacco executives are jerks and they're playing with your mind and we've got to like revolt and like, had people like kids graffitiing the outside of, whatever the tobacco companies were. And I think, how do you help adolescents feel like they can make a difference? People should be giving Kim Kardashian an awful hard time about her private jet. And that's a piece of sort of adolescent rebellion. That's basically what has made the climate strikers so effective. And that's why I firmly believe that if anyone's going to get us out of this mess, it's actually the young people who are going to sort of object to that status quo. I don't know if that gets it. Maybe you have something more coherent, Kelsey, but I love that.
No, I don't. Kelsey. I love that. And it does make me think of
You're muted, Kelsey.
Oh, am I muted? The beauty of the emotion of anger. It is so awesome when someone feels anger about climate change because we can help them understand that that means that something you value has been threatened and that's your body's signal that it's not okay with you. And B, how can you harness this beautiful biological signal that your body's throwing at you and think about what you find meaningful and what you find purposeful, and then have your action align with that. That could be calling out. That could be any number of actions, but helping people recognize and actually embrace their emotions that are uncomfortable to feel can be really, really empowering. And the job of anger is to help us approach something that we find unacceptable and a threat to our environment or something we value. The other thought I have is helping young people understand that there have been incredible efforts to make all of us think a certain way about whose fault it is that climate change exists. Not sure if that sentence made sense, but teaching kids about fossil fuel disinformation and misinformation, meaning we've essentially been lied to, and there's a lot of things that have been held back from us in terms of information. That can help people kind of situate their anger. Like, I am in a system that I individually cannot control. I must accept that to some degree. There are things that happened before I was born that I can't control. But now how can I harness these really important emotions and take an action that's in line with my values?
Thank you. Really appreciate that. So we're getting a couple of questions. I do just want to very quickly, for folks that are working with children again and families, do you need special training in climate and mental health to help youth sort of deal with their feelings around climate change? And if so, what can they do? I know that you share some resources at the end, so we'll definitely have those on the slides and they'll be available for download. But, climate change is happening, but I'm working with family. What do I do? What are some of those tools? Do I need special education? Am I even specialized in sort of climate concerns? So really just sort of attending to that.
Elizabeth, do you have
No, you don't need special training.
Yeah.
So what I would say is that I think whatever your discipline or your sort of approach, being climate aware, continuing to educate yourself, being curious, listening to young people, and sort of keeping that climate lens on, at least for starters, is as much as you need. I also think that having attended this webinar, you probably have more training than most people. It's a new field, and there's not, there's sort of, things are starting, but there's no certification or, whatever. There are a variety of training courses out there, but no, I don't think you need any special training to be thoughtful and to be starting these conversations with the kids you work with. What would you say, Kelsey?
I would agree. And I think something that maybe folks are feeling might be kind of an overwhelm or a sense of imposter syndrome, like, oh my God, I don't even know the science around climate change. I feel that way all the time. And it takes, I personally have had to do a lot of work to manage my own impostery feelings around all of the science around climate change. I will give a small tip. I watch kids like NASA videos to help myself understand the basic science of climate change in kids' terms. So that's what I can use with them. But there is no specialized training. Most graduate programs are not incorporating this into their training, which is tough because it's so prevalent for kids. But the most important thing is that climate distress involves emotions, thoughts, and behaviors. And even though it might be about a somewhat unique topic, all of us have training in how to support people's challenging emotions, thoughts, and behaviors. And that's really what we need. Being climate aware means that you're able to acknowledge and validate that climate change is distressing for people, that it's real, that you're not going to be someone who invalidates a young person when they come in with concerns. But you certainly do not have to know a lot of the science or have some sort of specialized training.
Great, thank you so much. So I am aware of time. I just want to see if we can maybe sneak in one last question that did come in. How and when do you incorporate that kind of political education in practice with youth? So we were just talking a little while ago in terms of how to sort of acknowledge what sort of narrative I've been told, and these are the systems that are created. When would be how and when would you incorporate that with youth?
In terms of the
sorry, I think you're on mute.
Can you hear me now? in terms of the fossil fuel industry stuff?
Yeah, and yeah.
I think that different people would answer this in different ways. I do a pretty heavy psychoeducation component to my climate aware therapy, because I think that it helps people situate their distress differently and feel more empowered. So I tell kids and adolescents about this up front, and a lot of them actually already know about it.
I would say I do the same, and I don't even necessarily consider it. I think it is interesting that we think about it as political. It's really just fact. And I think it is one of the reasons that it's so important that we be talking about this. Doctors, nurses, and pharmacists, I'm confident, therapists weren't one of the categories given, but I'm confident they're in there. Doctors, nurses, and pharmacists are considered the top 3 most reliable and trustworthy professions by people in the US. We are believed to be honest brokers of good information. And if we're not talking about this stuff really directly because we fear that it's perceived as political, then I think we're really doing people a disservice, and it's a lost opportunity. Everybody on this call, we are trusted messengers, and there's no bigger health threat or mental health threat out there. And so I think it's our duty actually to be talking about this stuff, including the fact that the fossil fuel industry is no more innocent here than the tobacco industry was with lung cancer. And if we're afraid to talk about that because we think we're being political, then I think it's a missed opportunity.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that. I am aware of the time. I'm wondering if we can bring up the slide with the Q&A. I know we just kind of went through a good portion of the Q&A here, but I did want to bring up your email address in case folks want to touch base with you. As I said earlier on, the recordings and the slides will be up shortly, but we went through the Q&A portion. Thank you for everyone that participated. I do want to take the time to thank Dr. Hudson and Dr. Pinsky for such a great discussion and helping to really raise awareness on this important issue, and for offering really practical strategies that folks on the call can really start to implement in their work with young children or teenagers, adolescents, but also their caregivers, right? There's also that component because it is a family unit that we focus on. On our next slide here, if we can just forward the slide, thank you. There are a couple of resources that were shared by Drs. Hudson and Pinsky. So we kind of broke it down in terms of reports. If you want sort of additional information, there is a focus components there in terms of the impact of mental health, the impact of climate concerns on mental health. I know that's one of the questions or comments that came up earlier on. There's also webinars for those of us that maybe don't want to sit and read or, eye strain per se, and just organizations as well. And I know that there are a good number of other ones. I do want to point out, I think Dr. Hudson, one of these actually, there is a way where you can find a therapist who is maybe a little bit more aware of climate concerns. Is that true in one of these organizations?
Yeah, the Climate Psychology Alliance and Climate Psychiatry Alliance websites, there's a climate aware therapist directory. It's pretty new, so it's not really comprehensive across the US yet, but hopefully it will be. And you can find therapists who are self-described as climate aware on a map of the US.
Great, thank you so much. So the slides will be available. On our next slide, we just have a couple of references in terms of some of the statistics that we mentioned, but I do want to highlight our upcoming events. We do have another mental health moment coming up, a conversation about meeting the needs of frontline workers, addressing the Great Resignation. Clearly, I think we've all heard of that across different fields per se, so we do want to focus a little bit more on the behavioral health field. And then certainly lastly, I do want to thank Drs. Hudson and Pinsky for such a great discussion. And again, really bringing awareness and those practical skills, because a lot of the folks on the call really are running from one meeting to the next, one appointment to the other. So really being able to implement that and think about ways that they can open up the conversation, create a safe space, and provide things that are appropriate for, children and adolescents. I also want to thank our audience members, clearly, for attending this webinar. As you close out the window, a survey will pop up. please take the time to fill it out. Let us know what some of your feedback is and any other suggested topics you think we should cover. And for any other additional resources, please visit our website and feel free to contact us at ctech.info@nyu.edu. So on behalf of myself, CTEC, and our presenters, we do want to thank you for attending and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you
Thanks.
so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.